Okay, so welcome everybody to part two of our topic, World War II. And today we are going to be discussing the rise of the dictators. And in particular, we're going to talk about three countries, Japan and its imperial nature, with its emperor and the fact that it tag teams with the Germans to stop communism. Then it starts to invade parts of China and treats some Chinese in particular in Nanjing, a city in China, really terribly, that it tries to co-opt people into cooperating after they've already bullied them around, and the fact that the United States is going to cut off Japan from some economic resources. We're going to talk about Italy with its dynamic and personable leader, Benito Mussolini. We'll talk about the government he instills, fascism, and the fact that they invade an African nation, Ethiopia, and their struggle for legitimacy, and they make a pact of steel with Germany. And that will take us to our last one, Nazi Germany, probably most famously led by Adolf Hitler. But we'll talk about the time before Hitler gains power in what's called the Weimar Republic, how hyperinflation can cause damage to a nation and really bring it down, how you can be a failed rebel and still come out on top with the beer hall punch, and write a book and make lots of money. Hitler does with Mein Kampf, and the fact that you can convince people to elect you, and then you can convince them to pass a law to make you a dictator with the Enabling Act, and once again the Pact of Steel shows up. So let's get started. So Europe here in the time period between World War I and World War II will have several dictators rise up. Here are four of the major ones, and we'll talk about two of these four guys at least today. And so certainly Germany will be led by Adolf Hitler here in the 30s, and Benito Mussolini will actually get in power here in the 20s, and Stalin as well in the 20s, and then Francisco Franco will be later in the 30s. So by the start of World War II, there are several dictators. Although this map is not completely accurate, there were some other dictators like in Austria or in Poland, but certainly lesser known. So first we'll talk about Imperial Japan. And so Japan had become a economic power. It industrialized, but there was this transition in the 20s from democracy to a military dictatorship. Essentially, the military gained more and more power. They were more and more aggressive. There was an economic crisis, and then the Great Depression kind of was two situations that made people lose faith in the government and look to the military for leadership. And the society in Japan was significantly devoted to Emperor Hirohito. Japanese society at that time believed that he was a descendant of the gods and really wanted to bring honor and glory to their nation, and they believed the best way to do that was to be ruled by their military. And so pretty quickly these military guys start trying to influence society, so they make because of their industrial limitations, being an island with not a whole lot of natural resources, they promote their soldiers to have this fighting spirit called Bushido, but essentially some of the characteristics are that surrender and retreat and defense are really not options. We'll see that the Japanese war machine is an aggressive one and not a very defensive one. And many young people were influenced and pressured by the government to support this new shift in attitude. Additionally, Japan will form some new alliances. They felt betrayed by the West, the United States and Western European allies after World War I. And additionally, they'll be condemned by the League of Nations and actually end up just leaving after they invade a place called Manchuria. We'll look at here in just a second. And they break ties and they go closer to Germany, and they renounce some of the moves they had made in the 20s to limit the size of their navy. So, and eventually, the Japanese will sign a formal agreement with Germany to stop communism. That was kind of their common denominator, what they both feared in the Soviet Union. So they said they would both help each other if attacked by the Soviet Union, and eventually Italy will also join that pact. And so when I said Japan will invade Manchuria, we'll look at some pictures and some info here in just a second. But essentially, at the mark of 1931, Japan held these islands as well as Korea as a territory, but eventually will invade this northern part of China with more natural resources and kind of an industrial part, and then will eventually swing down and invade central and southern China and take kind of the coast. And Japan will have a difficult legacy invading China, and their relationship even to this day is rocky. You can see from this chart here kind of the progression of actions, and we'll describe some of these here now. So the Manchurian incident is in 1931. The military leaders decide they're going to conquer this place for their natural resources so they don't have to rely on Western nations for trade. And they're pretty quickly able to do this because at this point the national Chinese government was really powerless. They didn't have a very effective military force. And they set up a puppet government called Manchukuo. But essentially these guys just do what the Japanese tell them to. And I like this political cartoon for a couple reasons, but we just see all these agreements that the Japanese had made or stated. Really, pieces of paper are just that. When nations decide to act and act aggressively, often the things they say mean less than the things they do. So the Japanese quickly show a pretty aggressive nature here once the military gets in control of Japanese society. Additionally, what historians call the Second Sino-Japanese War, but essentially when Japan invades China, there's a bunch of battles and fights, and the Chinese fight on the losing side of that, essentially. But one of the significant moments, at least in international eyes, is when Japan occupies this city, Nanjing, which was a fairly large city in China, because China at that time, and even to this day, had a big population. But the troops went in and really went on a rampage, killing civilians and soldiers alike. Now it's called the Rape of Nanjing. Having read about this, the Chinese kind of view this in maybe the same light that people might view the Holocaust in Europe. So 300,000 people are killed in some pretty terrible ways. There's some gory pictures down there of, and really just highlights the brutality that the Japanese are willing to go through to dominate and show their superiority. So additionally, what was after all that is they decided to pass what's called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. That's a big name, but essentially they said, Asians, we should stick together and trade and work together. But essentially what they meant is, everybody, you should be our little brothers, and you should work with us. And the United States and other nations condemned this, and for the first time, the United States didn't do a lot of action up until that point, but they do set up an embargo against the goods and the raw materials that Japan needed to continue its war effort, and eventually it will send supplies to the Republic of China to help fight the Japanese. So now we're going to switch to fascist Italy, and what ends up happening is, after the Treaty of Versailles, a lot of Italians were pretty disillusioned with the whole war, a lot of death and destruction for what they saw as very little gain, and Benito Mussolini is one of those guys. He's got an interesting past, which we don't have necessarily time to get into, but essentially he starts out a communist but then switches to a fascist, which is pretty different ends of the political spectrum. But he and some others proclaim the Fascist Party to really oppose social class discrimination, so they want to make things better for Italians, is what they're saying, and they want to support the rebirth, the glory of Rome, back in Roman times. And what they used is brutal force to get that, what they called the black shirts, but basically paramilitary thugs who would hurt people and intimidate them and assassinate them in hopes of gaining political power. There's this political crisis in Italy in 1922, which allows Mussolini to gain control, and basically he dismantles the country, democratically that is, and uses things like public works to lower unemployment and put in some national pride. And by 1929 he's called El Duce, or the leader, and he is clearly a dictator. Fascism will be the unique contribution that Mussolini and Italy brings, and we'll see some other nations take this idea and run with it. But essentially, the government and a military government, that is based around racism and nationalism with some support of the business community. So here you can see these are all kind of the tenets of fascism. So that these people are the best, that it has to do with superiority, and that the individual citizen is less important than the state and the country as a whole, so you should sacrifice yourself. There's this kind of cult-like worship around the leader usually, or at the very least the party. And there's this idea that we're rekindling the good old days, that we're rising from the ashes. The military is honored and glorified. Usually these countries are extremely sexist, so women are expected to be good housewives and produce lots of children for the nation, and men are expected to be strong and aggressive. They usually have a scapegoat that they're pointing to as a reason why they declined in the first part, and they're going to get these bad guys, whoever they say they are. They don't really care for human rights. Things like freedom of speech and freedom of expression are not that high valued. And usually these countries will somehow make an agreement with the religious majority in that country and basically create a marriage between the government and the church, saying you have your power and we have ours as long as we get along. And they will not like people who think outside of the box, like artists and intellectuals. So gaining a little bit more specifics, the fascists pushed for what was called the complete citizen. This person would have re-embraced these ideas of fascism. Essentially, there was this cult-like idea around Mussolini, who was a powerful speaker, and people really liked that, and that fascism would mold society along its ideals. So women, you have large families and kids, you get propaganda in school so that the nation controls textbooks, and teachers have to swear loyalty to the party, and that people should, I believe in Rome, the eternal, the mother of my country. I believe in the genius of Mussolini and the resurrection of the empire. There's a famous other saying, Mussolini is always right. But the Italians begin to expand their empire in 1935. They invade Ethiopia, and the Ethiopians, led by their emperor, claim the need for help from the League of Nations, and they get nothing. And so once again, proof that the international world is less interested in assisting people who are struggling. Another issue is the Vatican. Italy is a really Catholic country, and so the Vatican held a lot of sway over people, and these new leaders and dictators wanted legitimacy, essentially that they could prove that they were okay to have power. And they make this treaty with the Catholic Church, essentially saying, you take this role and we'll take this one. And this was a win for Mussolini. Additionally, he'll make friends north with the Germans in the Pact of Steel, so they'll create this, and Hitler will be a big admirer of Mussolini and actually steal most of his ideas on how to gain kind of a dictatorial power. So we'll see that these two countries start kind of this move towards dictatorships around the world, but certainly they won't end them. I'm going to pause here 1 second. All right, and so I wanted to jump to this simply because this is a review of some of the main ideas of Imperial Japan and Fascist Italy, and next we'll hit on Nazi Germany and its rise. So guys, I hope you have a good one. I will see you later.